Especially in the medical field, leadership is particularly important. However, often soft skill training isn't delivered. The question is, why are there so many areas where leadership training is direly needed, however, not much is done? And we have an expert on leadership here today. Hello and welcome, Francie Jain.
Hello, Niels. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you very much for taking the time. So, first, very impressive CV. I saw that you didn't only work in real world practice. I saw MBA from Chicago Booth and another degree from Princeton. So, you
Yeah.
know what you're talking about. So, what is the reason, in your opinion? Let's say
Yeah.
people know that leadership is important. Probably every single doctor in a hospital will tell you leadership is important. At the same time, when we see how many measures are implemented, how many trainings are provided, you see a rather limited number of leadership training or soft skill training in general provided to these kind of leaders. And the same applies to people in the STEM field, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics. What is the reason for that, in your opinion?
Yeah. Great question. I think because in the past, leadership and HR has been seen as kind of there's no, almost like a non-science, right? It's non-mathematical, it's non-scientific, but it turns out there's plenty of data around the benefits of good communication, the benefits of good leadership, the benefits of professional development. There's science and data around measurement around that. But in the past, I don't think it really was. I think if you think about the history of HR, it was like personnel, right? It was just people who kind of shuffled paperwork and got people
Hmm.
onboarded.
Yeah.
And now there's much more of a sense of understanding that if people are your number one line item, how do you get the greatest return on their potential? How can they help move your company forward? And if you can get a few 100% ROI on human capital, that will probably be the biggest driver of your organization, whether it's a business or a hospital, because they're measuring different things, certainly. Hospitals are measuring metrics like error rate or patient experience, burnout rate, things like that, voluntary turnover rate. But businesses are more probably measuring dollars and cents, but also retention. And so I just think I think that we're this period where there haven't been a lot of scientifically or mathematically minded people in the space of HR
Hmm.
or HR services, and so that's sort of coming to the fore right now. The other thing I would just add is that within that, there's this whole area of like management training that goes on, and even within that is personality assessment. And until you kind of understand how you think and how you see the world, I just don't think you can be a leader or be a good communicator. And
Hmm.
I didn't have a personal assessment until I was about 30, actually at Chicago. And it like blew my mind because it told me things about myself that I guess I knew, but I didn't really understand myself in the context of others. And that
Hmm.
was really, really valuable. And that's what is missing from all the STEM areas.
Excellent. So let's say I'm running a hospital. I'm the CEO, and probably you heard the phrase I'm not going to tell you when someone says, "Look, we're really interested in leadership training. However, we just don't have the budget." Everyone tells us we have to save money here and cut costs there. And now you're coming along and telling me to spend money. I don't have that money. How to counter that argument that most likely many managers in hospital also came along when they suggested that they need soft skill training?
Yeah, well, two things. I mean, one is what is the hospital's voluntary employee turnover rate? If it's above average or average to hospitals, they need to invest
Hmm.
in developing their employees. So right now, 20% is the average among hospitals, but that's still quite high, right? And is there any organization that just likes to be average? What happens to your organization if you have below average turnover? So
Hmm.
A, but the other thing B is that there's also, this is why everyone doesn't understand development as a science, right? Because how many times has someone said, we need to invest in this research and development, we need to invest
Yeah.
in this technology? It's the same thing. And if you actually put those investments head to head with human capital will win every time,
Mm.
because the return on investment is so high that, and it's also not even just high empirically, it's high compared to the peers who don't invest in human capital. And so what happens is if you are looking to have an advantage or you're looking to retain people more, I mean, there's so many ways to think about it, but human capital can be one of these like, sauce kind of situations.
Very good. So when now people say, okay, look, I might be a high-ranked executive in a hospital, and then I say, maybe I'm convinced of spending money on that. Of course, every single one of them is scared about one thing. What happens if someone says I spent the money and there is no trackable ROI? So how do
Totally.
I track the return on invest, especially on learning and development in a soft skill field where I do not just can measure a number and then say, okay, look, this is what we invested in seminars, trainings, coachings, and that is the ROI in dollars. So how can I have a
Yeah.
trackable, a proper
Yeah.
tracking of ROI in L&D learning and development?
Yeah. Yeah. God, I love your questions. It's so up my alley. So the thing that I really like to do that I recommend is almost to test it out in a group that's representative of other groups. So for instance, in a hospital, you might say, let's test out some group coaching in the orthopedics group.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to, do a survey before, do a survey after. We do a survey with also other groups that didn't receive the coaching. And the survey might touch on things like psychological safety, um, engagement with the organization, a willingness to stay. There are all sorts of things you can ask people and then see if there's a change after the coaching. And the other thing is you can also look at metrics. Right. That's one of the cool things about hospitals is they're so far advanced of many
Mm-hmm.
organizations in following and tracking metrics. And so metrics do change. Like one of the things that's really interesting is that there is a strong relationship between employee experience in hospitals and patient experience in hospitals. And there's also a relationship between burnout in nurses and poor experience with patients. And that's connected
Ah.
to error rate, all sorts of things. And so when you start to fix these problems, it starts to trickle down to these other metrics. But I do recommend, like, instead of going out like big and saying, oh, great, we're going to do it throughout the whole organization and like we're going to spend millions of dollars. I think what you can do is do it with a smaller group and just see like what starts to happen, get a little bit smarter so that maybe you tailor it more for your needs or your goals. I mean, one of the things that I believe in is like, I don't believe in just like throwing group coaching at these organizations. It's more like, okay, what's the problem? What are we working
Mm-hmm.
on? Because if you're not really clear about the goal or like the mission, how do you know what to measure? And so I think that that's really important. And there's tons of ways to measure this stuff. And like I work with this really cool professor at Columbia, and she's like at the intersection of HR and accounting. And there's
Mm-hmm.
also like a ton of accounting metrics as well. So you can get the finance team involved, and you can become really mathy, and in a way that gives you a lot of certainty and like comfort. But the other thing is like, the other thing I would say is we have this incredible case study with so we're like a marketplace. We don't have any IP. We connect great coaches to employers, but we have this one coach who's a PhD in psychology, and he's a system, and it's basically a system helping people learn psychological safety, and it's
Mm-hmm.
learning how to like connect with people who have different strengths than you to like solve problems, because in some situations that could be a reason to like avoid somebody, right? Because they're so hard to deal with, you can't like figure it out. But if you start to figure out the different strategies to work with people who are different, you have incredible solutions. So anyway, his content was used at a large health system in Colorado, and it was in a smaller town. It wasn't in Denver, and they had 24% employee turnover. And the average for hospitals is 20. So they were like, okay, we've got a problem because we're above average turnover.
Yeah.
We're in a smaller town. People aren't moving here. And on top of it, there's like plugging the gap, plugging the hole with traveling nurses, which is, everyone may know this on the call, but basically they're nurses who come for like 3 or 4 months and you pay them 1.5 or 2 times the going rate, the full-time rate for nurses.
Okay.
So it's kind of like this terrible spiral because you have high turnover, you're
And
plugging the
then you
hole
have
with people
higher costs for the
yeah,
payment
right.
for paying them 1.5 or
And
2 times as
and
much.
and and then it like screws up the morale because
Yeah.
every 4 months you have a person who doesn't know what they're doing, and so everyone's trying to teach that person how to like do stuff. And so anyway, so his like content group coaching was used throughout the organization. It was opt-in. The CEO got involved. Everyone, it was provided to everyone, anyone who wanted to come. No, it was not mandatory. That I think without, by the way, is really key. The not mandatory part, because humans like to decide for themselves. And what happened was every year the employee turnover rate went down 1 or 2%. And so then after year 9, it was at 4% employee turnover,
Wow.
which is crazy, right? And then they're winning awards. They're winning like best place to work, winning all these hospital awards. And then what was crazy is from the CEO told Dr. Thomas, my coach, that the difference in money between 24% employee turnover and 4% employee turnover was $32 million a year.
Wow. And
And
also that, isn't that the
it,
point? Because you probably heard
yeah,
one line quite often when someone says, okay, let's offer leadership training for the doctors, and they of course get the really great coaches and the great trainers. And when we go down to operational level, we have to give them the cheaper trainers and the cheaper coaches because we have
exactly.
to save money on that. We just can't send the great people and the best expensive people to them as well. That is then a straightforward, scientifically proven misperception and a wrong decision by definition.
Oh my God, I'm like crying. Yeah, 100%. And that's actually my original idea, which was what if you got these like experts and made it more affordable because of the group? Certainly, you can't afford these people to go one-on-one with like mid-level people or maybe people in the technology side or like the techs or whatever, but you can have 20 to 1. And like, therefore, you're getting really, really great insights and they're learning the same thing as the most valuable people. And another thing I would say, which is funny too, is that everyone needs to learn the psychological safety. Just because you are very good at one thing and maybe you're a doctor and you're a cardiologist, whatever, you had like a million years of training, it doesn't mean that you're great at communicating with people.
Oh,
and
yes. Yeah.
and it's kind of like that joke about sense of humor. Like everyone thinks they've got a sense of humor and like everyone thinks they're good communicators, but the thing is we can always be better. And I think to see that as like a growth mindset thing, the idea is like, let's keep it open to everyone so everyone has the ability to get better. And here's the thing, like they may not have been presented with this in the past, like this may just be foreign. And so great, like let's bring this to people who never had it, and things start to really change and shift. We had in-person training. It wasn't training, it was like I never know what to call it. It's like group coaching, but it's training with coaching, with discussion, with reflection, in Boston with a hospital group. And after these few hours, things really started to shift. And like doctors are saying things like, I know I don't mean to snap at people, but like, how can I slow down, or how can I change my tone? And it's that kind of thing. There's no blame being assigned, and no one's wrong and no one's right. But it's like, what's the North Star of your organization? And especially at a hospital, the North Star is, getting all those metrics as good
Yeah.
as possible, reducing the error rate, increasing, the patient experience, all these different things. And so that's the North Star. And if like we're all focused on that as a North Star, as opposed to protecting my ego as the North Star,
Mm-hmm.
hospitals will be great. And that's kind of, I think the point is like, we all need to like shift our minds a little bit to remember like what we're doing here. And like, I think that's why these trainings or coachings can be really valuable.
Excellent. Two more questions. So one of them is, and that's a really serious issue here, even more in the US, because we all know that in hospitals there's a high risk of people burning out. Burnout already in Europe is a massive issue because of all. So first, of course, people call in sick for a long time. Then it takes quite a while to get them back on track. And also, of course, especially as leadership misconduct can be connected to burnout. We know that in the US, there's not only a reputational, but also a straightforward legal challenge that can be connected with it that can cost you millions of dollars. But of course, let's focus on the humans. How can soft skill education make the situation better to reduce the burnout rate? Because we know that most hospitals focus on going on the lowest staff level possible, going on the lowest cost possible, and at the same point, hoping that no one burns out, which is, of course, a very thin line to walk. So, how can soft skill education somehow make the situation better that people don't burn out?
Yeah. So it's actually really interesting because employee turnover and burnout are just two sides of the same coin. In America, the employment contracts just aren't as long as in Europe. So instead of people burning out in the US, they're more likely to quit.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're but like for instance, I'm just doing a project right now in libraries. Libraries are more like the European model where people don't really quit, but they burn out.
Yeah.
And it's really the same thing. And it's that there's a lack, likely it's just a lack of psychological safety. And the reason I keep saying this is there's this incredible study that everyone should know about. And it was 2015 by Google. And they were for years trying to figure out what unites our best teams. And like, who doesn't want to be like Google, right? They're very, very smart company, innovative. And finally, they figured out the one thing that unites all their teams. It's not like where you live or where you went to school, blah, blah, blah. It's the degree of psychological safety in the group.
There you
And
are.
so what's so cool about that is it means that we can all do it.
Yeah.
It is, it's not a question of like where you were born or where you breastfed, all these things. It's really about like, do people feel like they can be honest, say what they think, and then the benefits to the group are a lack of groupthink, disparate viewpoints. There's just things are moving forward. And the other thing that I also like to talk about is there's this hysterical study. It was like an example of groupthink in the US when Coca-Cola tried to release New Coke. I don't know if you remember that. I remember that so
Yeah,
well.
I remember, and I remember that they read. I know that when it came to Europe, they backpedaled pretty quickly because
Yeah.
because
So
people
it
said
was like a huge mess.
we like Coca-Cola as it is, so just keep it that way, please. It's
Yeah,
just
even the Americans too. Everyone was like, "What? New Coke? We don't want new Coke." But basically, it was a group think problem. And they had some research showing that in a blind taste test, people picked Pepsi over Coke.
yeah,
But so they thought, oh, great, we'll just shift our recipe to be more like Pepsi. But the thing was, people who buy Coke want it to taste like Coke. And everyone was the same kind of type on that group. And there was no one saying, like maybe we do some focus groups or maybe we, like here's devil's advocate. Somehow that like was not resonating with the group.
hmm
And so I always take that as a real act. That's what happens when you don't have psychological safety and you don't have a diversity of thought, is that you make big, big errors. And that error was very costly. I had to look up, I never remember what they spent, but it was a lot of money because think about all the labels and the shipping and the marketing and all this stuff. It was a mess. Anyway, so my point is that psychological safety sort of ends up being the solution for burnout and turnover, because the point is that you don't want to leave. You're happy to go to work because you're able to come up with better ideas. You're able to problem solve with your colleagues. Things are working. Burnout is when you're trying to do your job and you feel like there's a disconnect between the rules and like what's happening, or like maybe your North Star and what's happening. And I think that is maybe not as directly linked to psychological safety, but this things not working and the rules not lining up with how things should be, that's also a problem, right? Because if a human feels like things are not right in the hospital, they're not being done right, like that is terrifying. Like, what does that mean? And certainly in America, we can talk about, there might be an insurance component to this, but I think the point is that burnout is what happens to individuals who are in a toxic or dysfunctional organization. And then people leave and quit from a toxic, dysfunctional organization. And the problem with leaving is it's the same thing as burnout, because at the end, if the whole industry has the problem, it doesn't matter where you go, you're going to have the same problem.
you just jump from one employer to the other to face the same problem.
Exactly. And that's when you start to hear about people who will take a job for 50 cents more an hour because they're like, you know what? It sucks everywhere. I might as well just get paid more. And like
Yeah, it's
50
just
cents
about
matters.
yeah.
Yeah, they're just like, this sucks. And then there's some statistic like, I was looking up for libraries, and it's probably the same for everyone, but people who've left the industry, like 80% will say it was because either they were burned out or they had burnout symptoms.
hmm
And so they're really connected is the end. And I think the point is like, you just need to find more ways to have like effective problem solving going on.
Yeah.
And then that will solve the burnout issue.
Excellent. So to wrap this all up, when now someone is listening to this and say, I think there's a really good point here, and I work for a hospital. However, I have to approach a person higher in the hierarchy and I have to convince them to move on with that matter because they are the only ones pulling the right levers, pushing the right buttons, getting the money ready and everything. How do I approach someone who at the moment is not in the right mindset doing this, but just moving on with the usual hospital day-to-day business? How can someone approach a higher ranking person in the hierarchy, convincing them of actually supporting and delivering soft skill training to our staff is an excellent idea? How can they do that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, one thing is I've been able to find some really nice like NIH studies that relate burnout to hospital metrics.
Hmm.
So for one thing, you can supply them with those studies, and I really like to look
Very
at them
good.
because it's like a nice correlation. But I think the other thing is like just experientially, even just creating a survey of one group or of the larger population, but just trying to understand what people would like to learn starts to get the ball rolling. And it could be part of a larger engagement survey if they do that. Like you might be able to add on a section where you talk about like, if you could vote for learning something more that would help you in your job, what would you vote for? And I think one of the things that I see a lot is like decision making being made without the input from employees
Hmm.
when it's the thing that's going to impact the employee, and like it's no skin off your back to ask them what they want because no one's omniscient. You can't just sit in a conference room and be like, I think we should do this thing for everyone, but like why don't you ask them? And I think that like you could say, listen, we have a budget for professional, we're thinking about doing this thing for professional development. Like, what would you like to learn about? And it doesn't have to be open-ended. It could be vote, here's some titles, or
Yeah.
here, what are some problems you encounter on your day-to-day basis that you think someone could come in and help you with? Just things like that. And I think the discovery process of hearing from your actual people about what would be valuable is probably the best way to do it.
Excellent. So when now someone says, I think I'd like to be in touch more with Francie Jain, how can they reach out to you? How can they find more of you? Is there anything available publicly, how they can get in touch and what they can find of you?
Yeah. So the best, if you want to sort of schedule like a call, I do like a Zooms with people, and that's on the website. So it's just terawatt.co and then get in touch. And that comes to me, and we can have as many calls as you want. I like chatting with
Yeah,
people. Um,
okay.
and then I'm on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, and Terawatt's on LinkedIn too. So that could be a good way if you like to see what I'm talking about. And that's, I guess, those are the best ways. And I love doing podcasts, so I'm on a lot of podcasts.
Perfect. I think these are the perfect final words. We see soft skill training, leadership training, professional qualification matters no matter where you work, no matter in which industry you are. And you can see that everything becomes better when you qualify your people also on the soft skill side. So at the end of this podcast and the end of this video cast, there's only one thing left for me to say. Francie Jain, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Real pleasure.